The air in the grand ballroom of the St. Alistair Hotel shimmered with the light of 1,000 crystals, each one a silent witness to high-stakes ambition. Richard Sterling, a man who wore his success like a tailored suit, stood with his arm possessively around his new muse, Tiffany. He was the king of this glittering world, or so he thought. He scanned the room for familiar faces, predators and prey in the city's corporate jungle. But the face he found was the one he least expected. Eleanor, his ex-wife, looking not broken but radiant, and on her arm, the man who owned it all. The St. Alistair's grand ballroom was a symphony of excess, a carefully orchestrated performance of wealth and influence. Crystal chandeliers, heavy as frozen waterfalls, dripped light onto the polished marble floors. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and blooming peonies, a fragrance Richard Sterling had always associated with victory. Tonight was his coronation. The annual Sterling Industries Gala was more than a corporate event. It was a testament to his dominance, a public declaration that he had not just arrived, but conquered. His arm was a proprietary brand around Tiffany's waist. She was exquisite, a perfect accessory for the man he had become. Her crimson dress, a daring slash of silk against her pale skin, clung to her in a way that announced she belonged to him. Her laughter, a tinkling, practiced sound, drew the eyes of men who both envied and loathed him. Richard savored it. He had molded Tiffany, plucked her from obscurity in the marketing department, and polished her until she shone with his own reflected glory. She was young, eager and uncomplicated, everything his ex-wife, Eleanor, had not been. "Richard, darling, Senator Thompson is waving at you," Tiffany whispered, her breath a warm puff against his ear. Richard's gaze slid past the senator, a man whose political career he had personally financed. He gave a curt, dismissive nod. Let him wait. Tonight, everyone waited for him. His eyes scanned the opulent room, a general surveying his battlefield. He saw the nervous smiles of junior executives, the predatory grins of his competitors, the fawning admiration of the city's elite. This was his world, a world he had built from the ground up, or so he constantly reminded himself and anyone else who would listen. The narrative was his most prized creation. Richard Sterling, the self-made titan. He looked so eager, Tiffany giggled, pressing herself closer, like a puppy. "They all do in the end," Richard murmured, his voice a low rumble of satisfaction. He squeezed her waist, a silent reminder of her role in this grand play. She was here to be beautiful, to be admired, and to be a living trophy of his success. A symbol that he had upgraded every aspect of his life, especially the woman on his arm. He thought of Eleanor then, a fleeting, ghost-like image. He pictured her in her drab, sensible clothes, probably curled up with a book in that sterile, minimalist apartment she'd rented after the divorce. The thought brought a smirk to his lips. He'd told her she was holding him back, that her quiet, introspective nature was an anchor on his ambition. She hadn't fought him. There were no dramatic scenes, no shattered plates, just a quiet, dignified sorrow that had infuriated him more than any screaming match could have. She had simply packed her things and left, taking with her an unnerving sense of peace that his new, louder life could never quite replicate. He had given her a generous settlement, more than generous, he'd insisted to his lawyers, to assuage the faint, nagging whisper of guilt. He had bought her silence, her absence from his new, glittering life. He assumed she would fade away, a forgotten chapter in his epic rise. The idea of her ever appearing here, in the heart of his empire, was laughable. She had hated these events, had called them gilded cages, where people traded pieces of their souls for a better stock price. She didn't understand the game. She didn't understand him. "Is something wrong, baby?" Tiffany asked, her brow furrowing in a practiced expression of concern. "You seem distracted." "Just enjoying the view," he said, his smile returning as he focused on the present. He brought a flute of champagne to his lips, the bubbles fizzing against his tongue. He was the master of this universe. Every person in this room in some way owed him something. Their presence was a tribute. His name, Sterling Industries, was blazoned in gold on the velvet banner behind the orchestra. It was a night of triumph, a night to erase the final, lingering shadow of his past. He leaned in to kiss Tiffany's temple, a public display of affection that was more about possession than passion. Having a good time? It's incredible, Richard. It's like a dream, she breathed, her eyes wide with a genuine, almost childlike awe that he found both charming and useful. She was still impressed by it all. Unlike Eleanor, who had seen the cracks in the facade, the desperation behind the smiles. Just as he was about to guide Tiffany toward the dance floor, a subtle shift occurred in the room's atmosphere. It was a barely perceptible change, a quiet ripple in the sea of chatter. Heads began to turn, not toward him, but toward the grand archway at the entrance. The confident hum of conversation faltered, replaced by a wave of hushed murmurs. Richard frowned, annoyed by the shift in focus. Who could possibly command more attention than him? He followed the collective gaze, his eyes narrowing. And then he saw her. The woman standing in the archway was Eleanor. But it was an Eleanor he didn't recognize. The mousy brown hair he remembered was gone, replaced by a cascade of honey-blonde waves that framed a face that was no longer soft and apologetic, but serene and confident. She wore a gown of deep emerald green, a color that made her eyes, which he'd once called quiet, now look piercing and profound. The dress was elegant, understated, yet it outshone every sequin and jewel in the room. She wasn't hiding in the shadows. She was commanding the light. A cold, unfamiliar knot tightened in Richard's stomach. This was not the woman he had divorced. This was not the woman who was supposed to be irrelevant. She walked into the ballroom with a grace that was neither timid nor aggressive, but utterly self-possessed. The whispers grew louder, a chorus of confusion and intrigue. But it wasn't just Eleanor's transformation that held the room captive. It was the man beside her. On her arm was not some new, younger man meant to spite him. It was an older gentleman, his silver hair impeccably styled, his tuxedo tailored with the quiet confidence of old money. He moved with an air of authority that made Richard's own manufactured power feel cheap and brittle. Richard stared, his mind racing to place the face. He was familiar, a figure he'd seen in the society pages, a name spoken in hushed, reverent tones in boardrooms he'd yet to conquer. Then, with a sickening lurch, the recognition hit him. It was Alistair Finch, the reclusive, almost mythical patriarch of one of the country's oldest and most powerful families. The man whose portfolio was the stuff of legend, and the man whose name was elegantly engraved above the entrance to the very hotel in which they stood. The St. Alistair. Richard's mind was a frantic cacophony, a storm of disbelief and rage. Alistair Finch, Eleanor's father. It was impossible, a lie, a trick. Throughout their 12-year marriage, Eleanor had spoken of her parents in vague, distant terms. Her father, she'd said, was a consultant, an academic who valued privacy above all else. She'd claimed he was a quiet man who disliked the city, preferring a secluded life in the country. Her mother had passed away years ago. He had accepted the story without question, too absorbed in his own ascent to probe the background of the woman who managed his home and soothed his ego. He'd seen her as a blank canvas, a simple, unassuming girl from a modest background. It had fit his narrative perfectly, the brilliant businessman plucking a simple librarian from obscurity and giving her a life she could only dream of. Now, that narrative was shattering like the champagne flute that suddenly felt slick and insecure in his hand. Consultant. The word was a bitter mockery. Alistair Finch didn't consult. He owned. He didn't follow markets. He created them. And he was looking around the ballroom, Richard's ballroom, with an expression of mild, proprietary amusement. Richard, who is that? Tiffany's voice, usually a soothing balm, was now a sharp, irritating prickle. Her grip on his arm had tightened, her painted nails digging into his sleeve. The awe had evaporated from her eyes, replaced by the shrewd, calculating glint he'd first noticed in the boardroom. She could sense the shift in power as keenly as a shark smells blood in the water. He didn't answer. He couldn't. His gaze was locked on Eleanor. He replayed their last conversation, the day she'd left. He'd been so dismissive, so condescending. "You don't have the stomach for this world, Elle," he'd said, gesturing vaguely at the city skyline from their penthouse window. "It's a world of sharks, and you're a goldfish." He'd expected tears. Instead, she had looked at him with a profound, unnerving pity. "Perhaps you're right, Richard," she had said, her voice impossibly calm, "but I'd rather be a goldfish in a clean bowl than a shark in a swamp." The memory, once a source of smug satisfaction, now curdled in his gut. Had she been laughing at him all along? Was their entire marriage a lie? He had paraded his wealth in front of her, boasted about deals and acquisitions, believing he was dazzling her with a world she could never have imagined. The irony was a physical blow, knocking the air from his lungs. He had been showing off his new speedboat to a woman who owned the entire marina. He forced himself to dissect the situation, his mind reverting to its default state of strategic analysis. Why now? Why this way? If she was the daughter of Alistair Finch, she could have ruined him at any point during their messy divorce. She could have bled him dry, exposed him, crushed his ambitions before they ever took flight. But she hadn't. She had taken his generous settlement without a fight and simply disappeared. The quiet dignity he had mistaken for weakness now looked like something else entirely: restraint. A lioness choosing not to swat a fly. The orchestra, sensing the drama unfolding, faltered in their melody before picking it up again with renewed, almost frantic energy, as if trying to paper over the gaping crack that had just appeared in the evening's facade. People were no longer looking at him with envy, but with a new, speculative curiosity. They were re-evaluating him, recalculating his worth. He could feel his stock price plummeting in the court of public opinion. "Richard," Tiffany hissed, her voice low and urgent. "People are staring. Do something." "Do what?" he snapped, his voice harsher than he intended. He watched as Alistair Finch guided Eleanor through the room. They weren't making a grand spectacle. They were simply moving, greeting a few people with quiet, familiar nods. The real power players in the room, the old money families, the titans of industry he had tried so hard to impress, were approaching them, not the other way around. They greeted Finch with a deference Richard had never been shown, a respect that was earned over generations, not bought over a fiscal quarter. And Eleanor, she was transformed. It wasn't just the dress or the hair, it was her posture, the way she met people's gazes without flinching. The quiet librarian was gone. In her place was a woman of immense, understated grace, a woman perfectly at home in a world he had always believed was his. He remembered complaining about her silence at these events, her tendency to retreat to a corner with a book rather than network. He'd seen it as a social failing, a liability. Now he saw it for what it was, a choice. She hadn't been intimidated. She had been unimpressed. His mind flashed back to 1,000 small moments, insignificant slights that now felt like monumental blunders. He remembered scoffing when she'd suggested a more philanthropic angle for the company, calling it soft. He remembered laughing when she'd expressed concerns about a particularly ruthless takeover bid, telling her she didn't understand business. He remembered the look in her eyes when he'd told her he was leaving her for a younger, more vibrant woman. It wasn't devastation, it was disappointment. As if she had expected better from him, and he had failed a test he didn't even know he was taking. Every memory was now tainted, recontextualized by the presence of the man at her side. Her quiet strength, her moral compass, her refusal to engage in his world of petty rivalries and shallow victories. It wasn't weakness. It was a different kind of strength, a strength rooted in something far deeper and more stable than his own fluctuating net worth. He had built an empire of glass and steel, but she came from an empire of bedrock. The full, horrifying weight of his miscalculation began to settle upon him. He hadn't just divorced a librarian. He had divorced the sole heiress to the Finch fortune. He hadn't just insulted a woman. He had insulted the daughter of the man who owned the very ground on which his empire was built. The St. Alistair Hotel was just one piece of a vast, labyrinthine portfolio of real estate, tech, and private equity. Richard Sterling, the self-made man, suddenly felt very, very small. His kingdom, which had seemed so vast and impenetrable only minutes ago, now felt like a child's sandcastle waiting for the tide to come in. And the tide, it seemed, had just arrived. The atmosphere in the ballroom had curdled. The champagne tasted flat, the music sounded tinny, and the glittering lights seemed to cast long, mocking shadows. Richard felt trapped in a spotlight of his own making, the heat of 1,000 watching eyes prickling his skin. He stood frozen, a statue of crumbling arrogance, as Eleanor and her father moved with effortless grace toward the center of the room. Tiffany, however, was not one to be paralyzed. Her survival instincts, honed in the competitive world of corporate climbing, were screaming. "We have to go over there," she whispered, her voice tight with a mixture of fear and opportunism. "We have to greet them, pretend this is all normal." Richard's throat was dry. Normal? Nothing about this was normal. Walking over there felt like marching toward his own execution. He could already feel the phantom sensation of his business partners' handshakes turning limp, their smiles becoming strained. But Tiffany was right. To do nothing was to admit defeat, to confirm his own irrelevance. He had to regain control of the narrative, and fast. He took a deep breath, forcing his features into a mask of casual confidence. "Of course," he said, his voice a strained imitation of his usual easy authority. He placed a hand on Tiffany's back and began to steer her through the sea of onlookers. The crowd parted for them, not with the deference of before, but with the morbid curiosity of spectators at a car crash. The whispers followed them, a rustling, venomous tide. "That's his ex-wife, with Alistair Finch. I had no idea." As they approached, Alistair Finch turned his head, his pale blue eyes, the same eyes as Eleanor's, settling on Richard. There was no animosity in his gaze, no overt threat. There was something far more unnerving, a complete lack of concern. It was the look of a man observing an interesting but ultimately insignificant insect. Eleanor saw them coming. Her serene expression didn't waver. There was no flash of triumph, no hint of smugness. She simply watched him approach, her composure an impenetrable wall. This was worse than any public tirade. Her calm was a judgment in itself. "Eleanor?" Richard began, his voice coming out smoother than he'd expected. He'd survived hostile takeovers and boardroom betrayals. He could survive this. "You look stunning. It's a surprise to see you here." "Richard," she replied, her tone even and cool. It was a voice he barely recognized. The warmth, the softness he had taken for granted, was gone. "I was in town visiting my father. He insisted we come." The simple, factual statement was a perfectly executed countermove. She wasn't crashing his party. She was attending an event at her father's hotel. She had every right to be there. He was the one who suddenly seemed like an intruder. "And this is your father?" Richard asked, the words feeling like ash in his mouth as he turned to the older man. "Richard Sterling. It's an honor, sir." He extended a hand. Alistair Finch looked at the offered hand for a moment before taking it. His grip was firm, his skin cool. "Alistair Finch," he said, his voice a quiet baritone that carried more weight than all of Richard's blustering speeches. "Sterling Industries. Yes, I've read your quarterly reports. Aggressive growth. Very leveraged." The compliment was double-edged, the final word delivered with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. Leveraged, a polite term for being built on a mountain of debt. In Finch's world, it was a synonym for fragile. Richard felt a flush of heat creep up his neck. Before he could formulate a response, Tiffany stepped forward, extending her own hand with a dazzling, desperate smile. "Tiffany Clark, Mr. Finch. It's a pleasure. Your hotel is simply magnificent." Finch's eyes flickered over her, a brief, dismissive glance that took in the expensive dress and the hungry ambition behind her smile. He didn't take her hand. He simply gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "My daughter has excellent taste," he said, his gaze shifting back to Eleanor, a silent dismissal that made Tiffany's smile falter. She let her hand drop, a flush of humiliation coloring her cheeks. In that single, brutal moment, her status had been irrevocably defined. She was not a player. She was a temporary accessory. The dynamic had been redrawn in front of the entire room. Richard, the self-styled king, had been reduced to a nervous suitor seeking approval. Tiffany, his gleaming prize, had been rendered invisible, and Eleanor, the discarded wife, was now the serene center of power, her position effortless and unassailable. "Well," Richard said, struggling to fill the cavernous silence, "we should let you mingle. I have guests to attend to." It was a weak retreat, and he knew it. "Of course," Eleanor said, her voice softening with something that might have been pity. "Enjoy your party, Richard." The words, so simple, so polite, were the final, devastating blow. Your party. As if he were a child playing make-believe in her father's house. He turned, guiding a visibly shaken Tiffany away, the feeling of 100 pairs of eyes burning into his back. The whispers were no longer whispers. They were open speculation. "My God, Richard, what was that?" Tiffany demanded the moment they were out of earshot, her voice a venomous hiss. "He completely ignored me. And the way he looked at you, leveraged? What does that even mean?" "It means he's old money and he doesn't approve of my methods," Richard lied, trying to project a confidence he did not feel. But Tiffany wasn't stupid. She had seen the deference in the room. She understood power. "Her father owns the hotel, doesn't he? The St. Alistair Finch." The name was a revelation and an accusation. "You told me she came from nothing. You said she was a librarian." "So that's what I thought," he ground out, grabbing 2 glasses of whiskey from a passing waiter and downing one in a single fiery gulp. "You thought?" Tiffany's voice rose, bordering on shrill. "You built your entire company on risk assessment and due diligence, but you didn't do a background check on your own wife?" The accusation hit its mark. He had been arrogant, blinded by his own narrative. He had wanted a simple, pliable wife, and so he had seen a simple, pliable wife. He had never looked deeper. He had never even asked. His empire suddenly felt as though it were built on quicksand. His lines of credit, his business partnerships, his carefully cultivated reputation, how much of it was tied, in ways he didn't even realize, to the invisible web of Alistair Finch's influence. Who had opened doors for him, thinking he was Finch's son-in-law? Who had extended credit, assuming a safety net that Richard never even knew existed? The thought was terrifying. He had thought he was a lone wolf, a predator. But what if he had been a pet all along, allowed to roam in a gilded cage, believing he was free? And what if the door to that cage had just been slammed shut? The emerald dress felt like armor. Walking into the St. Alistair on her father's arm, Eleanor had expected to feel a tremor of anxiety, a ghost of the insecurity that had plagued her for most of her marriage. Instead, she felt a profound and grounding calm. It was the calm that came from no longer performing, no longer trying to be someone she wasn't. For 12 years, she had tried to fit into Richard's world, to shrink herself down to fit the small, unassuming box he had built for her. Tonight, she was simply herself, Eleanor Finch. The months after the divorce had been a quiet unfolding. She had not fled to a tropical island to heal, nor had she thrown herself into a whirlwind of reinvention. She had simply gone home. Home was not a place, but a person, her father. His estate in the Hudson Valley, a sprawling property of old trees and quiet gardens, had been her sanctuary. There, surrounded by the familiar scent of worn leather and wood smoke, she had slowly pieced herself back together. Alistair Finch had not been the father Richard had imagined. He was not a distant academic recluse. He was a quiet man, yes, but his silence was one of observation, not disinterest. He was a titan who moved like a whisper, his influence so deeply woven into the fabric of the financial world that it was invisible to the uninitiated. He had watched her marriage to Richard with a patient, knowing sadness. "I never understood what you saw in him," he'd told her one evening as they sat on the stone terrace, watching the fireflies begin their nightly dance. "I thought he was brilliant," Eleanor had confessed, her voice barely a whisper. "He had this energy, this relentless drive. He made me feel like I was part of something exciting, and I was in love with the man I thought he could be." "You were in love with his potential," her father had corrected gently. "But you can't build a life on potential, Ellie. You build it on character, and his, I'm afraid, is built on a very shallow foundation." He had never interfered. That was not his way. He had respected her choices even when he knew they would lead to pain. He had provided her with an anonymous trust fund, enough to ensure she was never dependent on Richard, a fact she had kept hidden, knowing her husband's fragile ego couldn't handle the idea that she had resources of her own. She had wanted him to feel like the provider, the protector. It was a role he had relished, and a cage she had unwittingly helped him build. The decision to attend the gala had been her father's, but the choice had been hers. "He's holding his victory celebration in my hotel, Ellie," Alistair had said, his eyes twinkling with a rare spark of mischief. "It seems only fitting that the landlord should make an appearance, and I'd like you to be there with me." She had hesitated. "I don't want revenge, Dad." "This isn't about revenge," he had assured her, his hand covering hers. "Revenge is a fool's game. This is about reclamation. You let him define you for 12 years. It's time you reminded him and yourself who you are." So she had agreed. The preparation had been a quiet act of self-care. The dress, chosen not for its price tag, but for the way it made her feel strong. The hair, styled not to attract attention, but to reflect the new lightness in her spirit. Every choice was a deliberate step away from the woman who had lived in Richard's shadow. Now, standing in the ballroom, she saw it all with painful clarity. She saw the desperation behind the dazzling smiles, the fear in the eyes of the junior executives, the transactional nature of every conversation. She had always felt like an outsider at these events, and she had assumed the fault was hers. Now she realized she was an outsider because she didn't speak the language of avarice and ego, and she was grateful for it. She watched Richard across the room. He was trying to project an air of command, but she could see the cracks in his armor. She knew his tells, the slight tightening of his jaw, the way he ran a hand over his tie as if it were choking him. He was losing control, and for a man like Richard, that was a fate worse than death. Beside him, the young woman, Tiffany, looked pale and shaken, her fantasy unraveling in real time. Eleanor felt a pang of something that wasn't quite pity, but a sad recognition. The girl was just another casualty of Richard's ambition, a disposable asset. "He's not taking this well," Alistair murmured, following her gaze. "He was never very good at surprises," Eleanor replied, a faint, wry smile touching her lips. A portly man with a booming voice and a kind face approached them. It was Jonathan Sterling, Richard's uncle and the original founder of the company. He was the one who had given Richard his start, a fact Richard conveniently omitted from his self-made narrative. Jonathan had been squeezed out of the company years ago in a move Richard had described as necessary streamlining. "Eleanor, my dear," Jonathan boomed, enveloping her in a warm hug. "You look like a queen. It's been too long." He then turned to her father, his hand outstretched. "Alistair, a pleasure to finally meet you in person. I've admired your work for decades." "Jonathan," Alistair said with a warm, genuine smile, "I was sorry to hear about what happened at Sterling Industries. A company should never forget its roots." "Or its conscience," Jonathan added with a pointed look in Richard's direction. "My nephew has a brilliant mind for business, but a poor one for people. He builds skyscrapers, but he forgets they need a solid foundation." The conversation was a subtle but powerful realignment of allegiances. In full view of the room's key players, Jonathan Sterling was distancing himself from his nephew and aligning himself with Alistair Finch. Eleanor knew what this meant. It was the first domino to fall. She felt a weight lift from her shoulders, a weight she hadn't even realized she was carrying. It wasn't the thrill of seeing Richard squirm. It was the profound relief of seeing the truth, unvarnished and undeniable, finally come to light. She hadn't needed to say a word. Her presence, her quiet dignity, was enough. She was not the victim of Richard Sterling's story. She was the protagonist of her own, and she was finally ready to start writing the next chapter. The rest of the evening was a masterclass in social disintegration. Richard felt as though he were moving through water, every step requiring immense effort. The air, once electric with his success, was now thick with judgment. Conversations would halt as he approached. Smiles would become fixed and unnatural. He was no longer the host. He was the main exhibit in a museum of spectacular self-destruction. He watched as Alistair Finch and Eleanor held court, not with grand pronouncements, but with the quiet gravity that true power affords. They became the room's new centre, drawing a steady stream of the city's real influences. Richard recognized them all. Marcus Thorne, the head of the city's largest investment bank. Judge Catherine Riley, whose rulings could make or break corporations. Even the elusive tech billionaire Sebastian Croft, who rarely made public appearances. They didn't just greet Finch. They consulted with him, their heads bowed in quiet conversation, seeking his opinion, his approval. Each of these interactions was a nail in Richard's coffin. Thorne, who held a significant portion of Sterling Industries' debt, had clapped him on the back earlier in the evening, calling him the man with the Midas touch. Now Thorne was engaged in an animated conversation with Finch, and he didn't so much as glance in Richard's direction. The Midas touch, it seemed, was now highly suspect. Tiffany had become a liability. Her initial shock had morphed into a sullen, simmering anger. She clung to his arm not with affection, but with the desperate grip of a drowning woman. Her attempts to engage in conversation were met with polite but firm rebuffs. She was an outsider, a nobody, and by extension, she was making him look like one too. "We need to leave," she hissed after a particularly brutal snub from a real estate mogul's wife who looked right through her. "This is a disaster. You're being humiliated." "I am not being humiliated," Richard retorted through clenched teeth, though the words tasted like a lie. "This is a minor complication, a misunderstanding." "A misunderstanding?" Tiffany's voice was incredulous. "Richard, your ex-wife is the daughter of a billionaire, and you brought me, your mistress, to a party in her father's hotel. This isn't a misunderstanding. It's the plot of a terrible soap opera." He flinched at the word mistress. He had always thought of her as an upgrade, a successor. But Tiffany was right. In the cold, harsh light of this new reality, that's all she was. That's all anyone would ever see her as. His own executives were beginning to panic. He saw his CFO, a nervous man named David Chen, huddled in a corner with two of their largest shareholders. David was sweating profusely, dabbing at his forehead with a handkerchief, his eyes darting nervously toward Richard, then toward Finch, then back again. The shareholders looked grim. They were doing the math, calculating their exposure. A man who could make such a colossal error in his personal life was not a man to be trusted with their money. The final crushing blow came from an unexpected source. Richard saw Senator Thompson, the man he had kept waiting earlier, making a beeline for him. For a moment, Richard felt a surge of relief. Thompson was his man, a politician whose campaign coffers he had filled. Here, at least, was an ally. "Richard," Thompson said, his voice low and serious, his usual booming bonhomie gone. "We need to talk." "Of course, Senator. A bit of a surprising evening, wouldn't you say?" Richard attempted a casual laugh, but it came out as a strangled croak. Thompson didn't smile. "Richard, the Ethics Committee is launching a preliminary inquiry into the zoning variance for your downtown skyscraper project. It's probably nothing, just procedural. But under the circumstances—" He let the sentence hang in the air, the implication clear. "Under what circumstances?" Richard demanded, his blood running cold. That project was the cornerstone of his future plans, the monument he was building to himself. "The circumstances of you having made a very powerful and very quiet enemy," Thompson said, his eyes flicking toward Alistair Finch. "Finch has a great deal of influence on the City Planning Commission. He's a major proponent of historical preservation. Your project? Well, it's not exactly in line with that vision. I can't be seen to be backing a project that might have complications." The message was clear. The funding, the political cover, the support he had taken for granted. It was all evaporating. Thompson wasn't just warning him, he was cutting him loose. "I see," Richard said, his voice hollow. "My advice?" the senator continued, now a grim undertaker offering condolences. "Go home. Be quiet and pray this blows over." With a final pitying pat on Richard's shoulder, Thompson walked away, heading directly toward Alistair Finch to shake his hand. The room was spinning. The music, the laughter, the clinking of glasses, it all merged into a deafening roar. He felt a primal urge to flee, to escape the hundreds of eyes that were now dissecting his spectacular fall from grace. He turned to Tiffany, his face a mask of fury and desperation. "We're leaving." He grabbed her arm, his grip far from gentle, and began pulling her toward the exit, not caring about the scene he was making. He could feel her resisting, her heels dragging on the marble floor. "Richard, let go of me!" she protested, her voice a sharp cry. But he didn't listen. He just needed to get out. As they reached the grand archway, he dared one last look back. Eleanor was watching him, her expression unreadable. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't gloating. She simply watched him, a silent observer of the consequences he had set in motion 12 years ago. The day he decided that kindness was a weakness and conscience was a cost he wasn't willing to pay. He had built his world on a foundation of lies, and tonight the truth had brought it all crashing down. The days that followed the gala were a slow, suffocating bleed. Richard's world didn't collapse in a single fiery explosion. It crumbled piece by agonizing piece. The phone calls that had once been a constant, affirming stream of deals and invitations slowed to a trickle, then stopped altogether. Business partners suddenly became unavailable. Lines of credit were under review. The skyscraper project was officially put on hold, citing environmental impact concerns. A transparently flimsy excuse. The silence was more damning than any accusation. Tiffany was gone. She had packed her bags the morning after the gala, her departure as swift and transactional as her arrival in his life had been. There were no tears, no dramatic farewell, just a cold, hard assessment of her position. "My association with you is now toxic to my brand," she had stated, her voice devoid of emotion as she snapped a designer suitcase shut. "You have nothing left to offer me, Richard." It was brutal, but it was honest. She was a creature of his own making, and she had learned his lessons well. Loyalty was a commodity, and hers had just been sold to the highest bidder, which in this case was anyone but him. He was left alone in the vast, sterile silence of his penthouse, a monument to a life that no longer existed. The panoramic views of the city, once a source of pride, now felt like a mockery. He was a king in an empty castle. The rage that had sustained him in the immediate aftermath of the Gala had burned out, leaving behind the cold grey ash of despair. It was in this state of hollowed-out solitude that he found himself doing the one thing he would have thought impossible a week ago. He drove to the address his lawyer had on file for Eleanor, a discreet, elegant brownstone in a quiet, tree-lined neighborhood. He didn't know what he was going to say. He didn't know if she would even see him. He just knew that the silence of his own life was unbearable. He rang the bell, his heart hammering against his ribs. The door was opened not by Eleanor, but by a stern-looking housekeeper who eyed him with open suspicion. "May I help you?" "I'm here to see Eleanor," he said, his voice hoarse. "Richard Sterling." The housekeeper's expression soured further. "Mrs. Vance is not expecting you." She used Eleanor's maiden name, a small but significant blow. "Please," he said, the word tasting foreign and bitter on his tongue. "Just tell her I'm here." He waited on the stoop, feeling exposed and pathetic. He expected the door to be slammed in his face. Instead, after a few long moments, it swung open again. The housekeeper gestured for him to enter, her disapproval radiating from her like a physical force. He stepped inside. The house was the antithesis of his own. Where his penthouse was all sharp angles, glass and chrome, this was a place of warmth and comfort. Bookshelves overflowed with books, the furniture was soft and inviting, and the air smelled of lemon polish and old paper. It felt like a home. It felt like her. Eleanor was standing by the fireplace in a cozy-looking living room, a mug cradled in her hands. She wore a simple cashmere sweater and jeans. She looked calm, centered, and completely in control. "Richard," she said, her voice neutral. "To what do I owe this surprise?" He started, but the words wouldn't come. What could he say? "I'm sorry? You've ruined me? I misjudged you?" They all seemed laughably inadequate. She seemed to sense his struggle. She gestured to an armchair opposite her. "Sit down. You look like you're about to collapse." He sank into the chair, the soft cushions a stark contrast to the hard knot of anxiety in his stomach. She didn't sit. She remained standing, a subtle but clear indication that this was not a social visit. "Why, Eleanor?" he finally managed to ask, the question raw with a pain he couldn't hide. "Why do it? Why wait all these years just to humiliate me?" She took a slow sip from her mug before answering, her gaze steady and unwavering. "You think this was about humiliating you? Richard, your ego has always been your blind spot. This was never about you." "It wasn't?" he scoffed, a flash of his old arrogance returning. "It certainly felt like it." "What you felt," she said, her voice cutting through his bravado, "was the consequences of your own actions. For 12 years I supported you, I believed in you, I put your ambitions before my own. I kept my family background a secret because I knew your pride couldn't handle it. I wanted you to feel like the self-made man you were so desperate to be. I loved you, and I wanted you to be happy." Each word was a quiet indictment, a truth he had never allowed himself to see. "But your ambition became a hunger that could never be satisfied," she continued, her voice filled not with anger, but with a deep, lingering sadness. "You started cutting corners, not just in business, but in life. You pushed your uncle out of the company he built. You engaged in deals that were ethically questionable. You surrounded yourself with people who told you what you wanted to hear. You became a man I no longer recognized, a man I could no longer respect." She finally sat down, placing her mug on a small side table. "When you told me you were leaving me for her, it was a relief. It was the final confirmation that the man I had married was truly gone. It hurt, of course, but the real heartbreak had happened slowly, over years. He had no defense. Everything she said was true. He had sacrificed his integrity on the altar of his ambition, piece by piece, until there was nothing left. "The Gala," he whispered. "My father found out about the zoning variance for your skyscraper," she said simply. "He knew you had bribed city officials. He has a vested interest in maintaining a certain level of ethical conduct in this city. He was going to intervene with or without me. He asked me to be there because he thought it was time you faced the truth. Not just about who I am, but about who you've become. It wasn't a conspiracy. It wasn't a long-planned revenge plot. It was simply a reckoning. A moral audit he had spectacularly failed. "I didn't want to destroy you, Richard," she said, her voice softening. "I just want you to be a better man, the man I once believed you could be." He looked around the warm, quiet room, a place of peace and authenticity. He looked at the woman sitting opposite him, a woman of immense strength and grace whom he had mistaken for a fragile doll. He had chased after a glittering illusion of success, and in doing so, he had lost the only real thing he ever had. There was nothing left to say. He had come here looking for a fight, for an explanation, for some way to shift the blame. But there was no one to blame but himself. He had been the architect of his own downfall. He stood up, his body feeling heavy with the weight of his own failures. "I'm sorry, Eleanor," he said, the words finally coming, not as a strategy, but as a simple, painful truth. "For everything." She just nodded, accepting the apology not as a victory, but as a necessary, long-overdue first step. As he walked out of her home and back into the cold, empty city, he knew this wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a long, arduous journey. The journey of finding out if there was anything left of Richard Sterling worth salvaging. The world that Richard had meticulously constructed continued to unravel with a quiet, brutal efficiency. The word leveraged, which Alistair Finch had so deftly deployed at the Gala, became his epitaph in the financial community. It was a polite, clinical word for finished. The banks, led by Marcus Thorne, called in their loans. The shareholders, spooked by the sudden instability and the stench of scandal, staged a revolt. The board of Sterling Industries, filled with men Richard had appointed and controlled, called an emergency meeting. He walked into the boardroom, a place where his word had once been law, and was met with a wall of averted eyes and grim, joyless faces. David Chen, his once trembling CFO, read the motion to remove him as CEO with a steady, rehearsed voice. It was a bloodless coup. He was offered a severance package and the title of Founder and Special Advisor, a meaningless gesture designed to avoid a protracted legal battle. He was being exiled from his own kingdom. He didn't fight it. The fire had gone out of him. He signed the papers, packed the contents of his office into a single cardboard box, and walked out of the building that bore his name for the last time. The security guard at the front desk, a man he had seen every day for 5 years, didn't meet his eye as he handed in his access card. He was already a ghost. He sold the penthouse, a move dictated by financial necessity. The sale was a fire sale. His desperation, a tangible scent that real estate vultures could smell from miles away. He moved into a small, furnished corporate apartment, a beige box that was a perfect reflection of his new, diminished life. The silence was no longer just in the absence of phone calls. It was a profound, internal silence, the death of his own roaring ego. His days became a formless grey expanse of time. He tried to network, to find a new venture, but his name was poison. The men who had once courted his favor now crossed the street to avoid him. He was a cautionary tale whispered at cocktail parties and in exclusive country clubs. It was during this time, in the depths of his forced irrelevance, that the real reckoning began. Stripped of the external validation of wealth and power, he was forced to confront the man he had become. He would lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling of his anonymous apartment, and the memories would come. Not the curated memories of his own success, but the real ones. He remembered the look on his Uncle Jonathan's face when he'd been forced out of the company, a look of profound betrayal and hurt. He remembered the eager, hopeful faces of the young employees he had fired without a second thought during restructuring. He remembered the dismissive, cruel way he had treated Eleanor, snuffing out her passions and belittling her intelligence because they didn't serve his own ambitions. He had always seen business as a battlefield, a zero-sum game of winners and losers, but he had applied that same brutal logic to his life, to his relationships. He had seen people not as human beings, but as assets or liabilities. Tiffany had been an asset until she wasn't. His uncle had become a liability, and Eleanor, he had made the catastrophic error of classifying her as irrelevant. One afternoon, driven by an impulse he didn't fully understand, he found himself outside his old company building. He saw his Uncle Jonathan walk out, laughing with a group of young executives. Jonathan had been brought back, reinstated as chairman of the board. The news had been a small item in the business section, but it spoke volumes. The company was seeking to regain its soul, its conscience. It was seeking to undo the damage that Richard had done. He didn't approach him. He just watched from across the street, a spectator to a life that was moving on without him. He felt a pang of something that wasn't envy, but a deep, aching regret. Jonathan had built the company on principles of integrity and quality. Richard had built it on debt and aggression. And in the end, integrity had won. The bottom, when it came, was not a dramatic event. It was a quiet Tuesday afternoon. He was sitting in his beige apartment, the TV droning on unnoticed, when he caught his reflection in the dark screen. He saw a man he didn't recognize. A man with hollow eyes, a stranger haunted by the ghosts of his own choices. And for the first time in his adult life, Richard Sterling wept. They were not tears of self-pity or rage. They were tears of genuine, soul-crushing remorse. He wept for the man he could have been, for the love he had thrown away, for the trust he had betrayed. He wept for the emptiness inside him, an emptiness that no amount of money or power could ever fill. It was in that moment of complete and utter brokenness that a tiny, fragile seed of something new began to take root. The reckoning was not just a punishment, it was an opportunity to strip away the rotten, corrupted edifice of his former self and see if there was anything of value left underneath. The process would be painful and the outcome uncertain, but for the first time in a very long time, Richard felt a flicker of something that was not ambition, not pride, but a faint, terrifying whisper of hope. The hope that, perhaps, it was not too late to learn how to be a good man. While Richard's world was contracting into a small, beige box of regret, Eleanor's was expanding in ways she had never anticipated. After the gala, she had intended to retreat back to the quiet sanctuary of her father's estate, to her books and her garden. But her father had other plans. "You have a good mind, Ellie," he told her, over one of their customary evening chess games. "A better mind for people and principles than half the executives on my payroll. I've been semi-retired for too long. The Finch Foundation needs a new vision. It needs you." The Finch Foundation was the philanthropic heart of her father's empire, a sprawling organization that funded everything from medical research to arts education. For years, Eleanor had followed its work from a distance, feeling a strange disconnect from the name she shared. Now her father was inviting her in. He wasn't giving her a consolation prize, he was offering her a purpose. She started slowly, tentatively. She spent weeks in the Foundation's offices, not in a grand corner office, but in the archives. She read through decades of grant proposals, financial reports, and impact statements. She spoke to program directors, to researchers, to artists. She listened. For so long, her own voice had been suppressed, and she found a deep, satisfying joy in amplifying the voices of others. She discovered she had a natural aptitude for it, Her quiet, observant nature, which Richard had scorned as a social weakness, was an immense strength here. She could see the human element behind the numbers, the passion behind the proposals. She wasn't interested in funding the flashiest projects. She was interested in funding the ones that would create real, lasting change. Under her guidance, the foundation began to shift its focus. She championed smaller community-based initiatives, programs for early childhood literacy, and scholarships for underprivileged students. She had a knack for seeing potential where others saw risk, for investing in people, not just ideas. She was building something, not with steel and glass, but with compassion and integrity, and for the first time she felt a sense of professional fulfillment that was entirely her own. She wasn't Richard Sterling's wife or Alistair Finch's daughter. She was Eleanor Vance, the director of the Finch Foundation. About a year after the gala, she was overseeing the final touches on a new inner-city youth centre the foundation had funded. It was a beautiful, light-filled space, with a library, a computer lab, and an art studio. The sound of children's laughter echoed in the halls, a sound she found more rewarding than any round of applause in a corporate ballroom. As she was leaving for the day, she saw a man standing across the street, looking at the building. He was thinner than she remembered, and he wore a simple, unassuming jacket instead of a tailored suit. It was Richard. Her first instinct was to turn and walk away, but the man she saw was not the arrogant titan she had divorced. There was a quietness about him, a lack of the restless, predatory energy that had once defined him. Against her better judgment, she found herself walking toward him. He saw her approach and didn't flinch. He just watched her, a complex mix of emotions in his eyes. "Hello, Eleanor," he said, his voice quiet. "Richard, what are you doing here?" He gestured toward the youth center. "I read about this project in the paper. It's remarkable. What you're doing." "I enjoy it," she said simply. An awkward silence fell between them, filled with the ghosts of their shared past. "I got a job," he said almost shyly, "working for a small non-profit that helps entrepreneurs from disadvantaged backgrounds get startup loans. It's not glamorous." He gave a small, self-deprecating smile. "My Uncle Jonathan helped me get it. He said I needed to learn the difference between building an empire and building a community." Eleanor was surprised. She had heard he had lost everything, but she had assumed he would try to claw his way back to the top. This was something different. This was a step in a new direction. "That sounds admirable," she said, and she meant it. "I'm learning," he said, looking down at his hands. "I'm learning that a person's worth isn't measured by their stock portfolio. I needed to thank you, Eleanor." "Thank me?" she asked, confused. "For showing me what I had become," he said, finally meeting her gaze. His eyes were clear, free of the arrogance and deception that had clouded them for so long. "You didn't destroy my life. You saved it. You saved me from myself." It was the most honest thing he had ever said to her. In that moment, she saw a glimpse of the man she had once loved, the man of potential she had believed in all those years ago. She knew they could never go back. Too much had been broken. But the bitterness she had carried for so long was gone, replaced by a sense of peace, of closure. His redemption was not her responsibility, but she was glad to see him finally on the right path. "Take care of yourself, Richard," she said, her voice soft. "You too, Eleanor," he replied. She turned and walked away, not looking back. The sun was setting, casting a warm, golden glow over the city. A new dawn was breaking, not just for the children in the youth centre, but for both of them. Their stories were no longer intertwined. They were on separate paths now, both walking toward a future they had to build for themselves, one quiet, honest step at a time. From the glittering heights of arrogance to the humbling depths of reckoning, this was a story of a man who lost his empire to find his soul, and a woman who stepped out of the shadows to reclaim her own power. Their journey reminds us that true strength isn't about the world you build, but the character you build it with. It's a story of betrayal, hidden truths, and the quiet, unyielding power of integrity. If you were moved by this story of emotional transformation and cinematic justice, please hit the like button, share this video with someone who loves a powerful drama, and subscribe to the channel for more unforgettable stories that explore the complexities of the human heart.